Hello and welcome to All the Things.
Hello, welcome to All the Things. I am Monique Duson.
And this is the show where we discuss all the things related to God, the Bible, and real life.
Yes, it is. How are you? I'm not there. I'm here.
I know. And you got to center yourself.
In the physical sense or in that Zen sense?
In the shot. You're like way off center.
Well, in my view, I'm centered.
Okay.
All so right. That's yes.
You're creeping there a little bit more to the left.
Well,
there we go. All right. Yeah. So we're live. So this is the shenanigans.
These are. I kind of low key miss you, but I do enjoy sitting in my house.
I know. It's Saturday night. So one Saturday a month, we let Monique stay at the house. She doesn't have to drive all the way over here to the studio. But glad to see your smiley face. And I want to say thank you to our moderator tonight, Sylvia, helping us out in Montana. So what have you been up to?
Today has been a day full of homework. I am reading a couple of different books. I am currently reading a book on research and theological research and writing. And then I'm also reading The Coddling of the American Mind. And I just finished a book I don't remember the title, but a book on for new theologians. And so, yeah, I've gone through 2.5 books in the last 2 days.
Awesome.
So yeah, doing a lot of reading, and then I meal prep today. So I made lunches for the next 4 or 5 days.
Oh, wow. Okay.
What about you?
Yeah, same. Lots of reading, working on my dissertation. I told myself I was going to stop working on it at 4:00 and then watch the baseball game with Bob for a little while. And in the second inning, I just conked out. I think because I stopped working, like my whole body was like, okay, we're done. Bye. And when I woke up, it was 5 minutes
for the show
until I was supposed to be on with you for the show prep. I was like, oh no. But yeah, I've been reading a lot of feminists, communists, feminists who are communists, and trying to understand standpoint theory. So that's a lot of what I've been up to.
Well, good luck with that. Yeah. Good luck.
I know. It's very exciting. People are jealous.
No,
not really.
No, not really. Not really. But you know what? When you're done and you're like finished with your dissertation and you've read all the crazy, then you can talk to our guest tonight to figure out how to get yourself back centered.
I texted you earlier today. I said, these feminists are radicalizing me. I can really understand, how people go to college or grad school and get radicalized. I mean, you read this stuff and all the voices are just kind of saying the same thing and they're quoting each other. And it's like you walk into this echo chamber where everyone's speaking in a certain kind of a way and they all believe the same thing. And you're like, wait, what just happened? Like, I don't speak like this, but when it just keeps reinforcing itself. And I can understand if I was a young person and someone was telling me this is how to think, I could get sucked into that.
Yeah. I mean, this is why it's important to have an objective standard and something outside of ourselves as the standard of truth and the standard of reality.
Yeah.
Because, when you do walk into an echo chamber, because some people could say that Christianity is an echo chamber. Like I walked into this church and it was just an echo chamber.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's like, what is the objective truth? What is the standard by which we are measuring things? And so it's not a standard, within ourselves, something that's outside of us, where what I would say with things like feminist theory or standpoint theory and standpoint epistemology, like all of that, they create the standard.
Yes, and they're very clear about an article I was reading today. Like she was being very clear. I am creating a competing standard to the classical project that truth is out there.
Yeah.
and it's something outside of us. No, it's based on a particular standpoint, feminist standpoint, and here's everything that's wonderful and great about the feminist standpoint. I'm like,
Yeah.
wow, okay.
Yeah. But
So
boo boo, you not gonna get radicalized. We not today, Satan. We not having that. You can read the little books and all that. Take a
oh
break, go for a walk when you need to. But
yeah. Bob
yeah,
finally
we not
came
having
by
that.
my office and took me outside to get some sunshine. So that was nice. He took me on a walk.
Well,
So
I'm glad somebody did because I sure wasn't. I was staying at home reading my own homework.
yeah, Victoria's on the stream. She says undergrad and grad school definitely brainwashed me. Victoria has a kind of a little bit of a similar story like you did, Monique, of
Yeah.
coming out of social justice, but she was working in that field up until maybe like 2 years ago. So
I think it was maybe a little bit longer than that, but here's what, I had texted you earlier is that it's so easy for Christian young people to get swept up into this ideology in
yeah.
institutions like an Azusa Pacific or like a Biola or a Wheaton,
Oh, you're just
where,
naming names out now. You're just out in the
honey,
streets naming names.
we not,
That's what
no,
we're
yeah,
doing
because we're
now.
not. 4 years, babe. This is where we at. It's easy because you continually hear this rhetoric of radicalization, but they also now baptize it in Jesus. And so
Yeah.
this is the Jesus that you missed out on.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And this is really the way that you do good work. It's through this radicalized language. And you have to remember that you need to be radicalized because liberation only comes through revolution.
Yeah.
And so that radicalizing, baptized in Jesus, is what will create the Christian warrior, the Christian revolutionary, the Christian, person who can, usher in some kind of totalitarianism or whatever that end goal is. But yeah, it's really, it's deep. I'll just say that, but we need to keep going. I
Yeah.
could talk
No,
about this
it's
for a long
that's
time.
good because man, if they were adding Jesus to all of this and I was like a 25-year-old grad student, I would be very confused. I can see
Yeah.
why so many Christian young people, if they're going into fields like we're going to talk about tonight, like psychology or education or um, social work, and this is the literature that they're interacting with. And then if I had a professor who was kind of adding Jesus, sprinkling Jesus on top of that, that would be big confusing. Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
do,
I'm going to transition a little bit
yeah.
and talk about, tonight's show being about mental health and just how do we approach this topic as Christians? How do we have some of these conversations? I feel like too often, and in your circle, it might be different. This is why I'm saying I feel like in my circle and things that I've seen, it isn't often talked about unless you specifically know someone who works in the mental health field. But how do we have good conversations around mental health? Or, what should I look like if I am looking to go and receive, support through therapy or counseling? Is that okay? Is it taboo? Should I only be praying and listening to the Holy Spirit? Or, should I only be talking to my pastor? What are the perks or pros of getting pastoral counsel versus maybe meeting with someone who has a degree in a mental health field? Or what are the pros of seeing someone who specializes in the mental health field versus someone who is maybe a pastor or something like that, but doesn't actually specialize in the mental health field? So
And
tonight our guest is David King, and he serves on our academic advisory council. He actually works at Indiana Wesleyan University as a social work professor of social work. Sorry, I got my words tongue tied. But I can't wait to have this discussion. Mental health is something that is dear to my heart, even before I moved to Africa and before I moved home with PTSD. And so I am looking forward. Let's bring David on.
yes, welcome, Dr. King.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hello, hello. So
Hello.
Why don't we start out with you just giving us a brief introduction of yourself and how you got into the space of trauma and helping others to recover from trauma?
Sure. Well, it's been a long journey. So my kind of introduction to the whole world of mental health was back in college. I was at a state university and had a friend who was volunteering at a local crisis hotline for suicide and kind of people coming in off the street with various problems and needs. And so I started volunteering at that crisis center where I got some initial training and just kind of how to respond to people and help them through that kind of thing. So I ended up minoring in social work as in my college major, and then from there went on to pursue a master's in social work as well as a master's in pastoral counseling from Asbury Seminary, which was awesome. It was kind of at some of the early stages of kind of some of the Christian counseling movement, and was able to sit under some great people who were kind of pioneers in that field in terms of faith integration and really trying to look at things through a biblical lens. And then I've spent most of my career working in community mental health settings as well as church settings. I've run different programs for people with chronic mental health issues, as well as substance abuse related things, and also done private practice most of that time in terms of working with individuals and couples in sometimes Christian, sometimes not, and then been more in academia the last 8 years full time. So had a broad range of experiences that kind of got me here, but certainly trauma and working with people with kind of emotional hurts and pain kind of coming from their past is a big part of the work that you do as a therapist. So that's just been a really important piece for me to kind of pull together. And so now I also have kind of a program that I do specific to kind of Christian approach to working through those trauma issues from a biblical perspective. So.
That's awesome. And I think that what is helpful about you, Dr. King, is that, you are looking at things and trying to wrestle with the field of psychology, mental health, and counseling from a distinctly Christian point of view. And you had actually reached out to us, I think maybe back in 2020 or early 2021, very early in the ministry. You had reached out to us and written us a note, and we hopped on Zoom, and that was kind of our first sort of meeting with you. And our paths just kept crossing, and we're just so excited to have you part of our academic advisory council now, given your background, and looking forward to walking together in that way. But I think that um, before we get into the trauma component, let's just start from the worldview component and talk about different approaches to Christian counseling, because I've been in counseling, Monique's been in counseling, Monique's even been on, as a kind of a paraprofessional in the mental health field. And I've been in counseling a couple of times. For the last time I was in it for 10 years, I was dealing with significant mental illness issues. And one thing I learned from that is that you can call someone a Christian counselor, or they can call themselves a Christian counselor, but not all Christian counselors do the same thing. They don't all do counseling the same way. So maybe you can walk us through kind of the major streams of thought that people are likely to run into if they're talking to somebody or trying to vet somebody who's a quote unquote Christian counselor.
Yeah, appreciate that. And again, I love that you guys, I know I don't love that you had to go through that, but I love that you have that perspective and just all the practical work you've also done in these areas that you bring to the table in this work. So yeah, so the reality is that most Christian counselors or people who are calling themselves Christian counselors have not been trained specifically in Christian counseling. There are great programs out there. There are people out there who kind of been trained in very specific Christian worldview approaches, but the vast majority have not. And there's not a lot of training that you can get necessarily outside of a university setting to really learn how to do that well. There are some organizations that, professional organizations that help with some of that stuff. But it is often kind of a process that people are just trying to figure out on their own. So you're going to get a wide variety. And plus, you have mental health professionals are trained in a variety of ways. I teach social workers at a master's level, which is a pretty common type of license for a therapist, but you also have marriage and family therapists, you have counselors, you have mental health professionals, and they're all qualified, licensed people in a state, but they're going to come from a slightly different theoretical perspective, possibly, or a different set of skills. So there really is stuff to kind of think about. And I think we're going to post a link at some point to a guide that can be helpful in terms of helping people think through this more deeply. But on a broader level, you want to think about kind of their approach to integration. So just because I'm a Christian, again, like you guys were just talking about sprinkling Jesus on certain ideologies, the same thing can happen in therapy all the time. So some people have a very isolated approach, is what I would think of it as, where their Christianity is the main focus. This isn't as common, but there are people that, they're only going to quote you Bible verses. The focus is going to be very much on just very biblically based counting, which again isn't all bad necessarily all the time, but it's not really connected to other theories or other broader views that the person is bringing in. And so that's why we call it isolated. It's just
So when
very
you say isolated, you're looking at it from the perspective of here's kind of the professional world and the literature and the methodologies, and there's one approach of people who are called themselves Christian counselors or biblical counselors, and they're kind of isolated from the larger conversation on psychology. So that's what you mean by isolated.
correct. And so
Okay.
it tends to be a very overly spiritualized approach, right? Or it's let's say just more of a one-dimensional kind of approach, if you think about it that way.
Now there will
And
be some people who will take issue with even how you're characterizing that. That you're front loading it out of the gate and revealing your bias, that you're not a fan of this approach. And so I just want to acknowledge up front, that some people are going to hear it through that lens, and they're going to be like, "Oh, he's against biblical counseling. He's against Bible verses. He's against prayer."
yeah, of course not. And I use all of those in my own practice as well. So it's not, again, we use the word isolated because just trying to put it in the category of um, very distinctly separating that stuff out or focusing only through one lens. And again, because of my view, I don't think that's always inappropriate or always unhelpful. But it's something we have to kind of acknowledge and be careful with
Okay.
sometimes in terms of how we look at things. So I hope that helps to clarify.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Yeah. So another approach would be kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, which would be accommodating, in the sense that people who are saying they're Christian, but really not really discerning very well what part of a theory or approach is Christian and helpful, or not integrating things very well. And so they're just kind of buying into the ideology or the philosophy or the methodology, and just going, oh, it must be okay because that's what I was taught in my master's program. And sounds like a good theory, just like you're talking about the feminist stuff getting bought into, same idea. It's just maybe I'm very Freudian in my approach, but I still, I'm a Christian, go to church, or things like that. So, but it's very accommodating in terms of not really working through what parts are biblical and what aren't in terms of a theory or approach.
Now here on this one, I just want to help people understand, that we're talking about, this is something you do so well, David, is helping people understand the importance of worldviews. And that's really part of what we're talking about here. When we say accommodating versus integration, which we'll get to is the third kind of approach, is accommodating is basically just bringing in all of the psychological models and methodologies. You might still pray with your client, or you might offer them to read like a particular book by a Christian person, but basically you're taking what you learned in your grad program, bringing that into the therapy room and using that. You're a Christian, who is using these modalities and not really thinking about, are there any implications here? Are there any structural thought patterns that I should question? Some assumptions of the framework that I should question? That's not really how psychologists are trained. So that's what you mean by accommodating.
Right. And again, I want to be clear, again, because again, I understand like people have benefited from a lot of these things. So again, I'm not trying to um, say that all this stuff is bad. Again, whichever camp we're talking about,
Right.
there might be good things that somebody benefited from that was helpful. The therapist doing it in every category might be very sincere. God can use anything, so it doesn't mean that the idea isn't to throw all the babies out with the bathwater, but to try to have some understanding of where people sometimes fall and just ways of thinking about how to approach what this means when you think about Christian counseling.
Very good. Okay, so now you've mentioned it. The third approach is the integration approach. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so the goal here obviously is to make sure that as we're learning things from the world and looking at evidence or theories, is that we're really integrating them well with a biblical perspective. And sometimes that might even word sound weird, in the sense of I'm integrating something with scripture. But what we're really saying is, does it align with biblical principles? Is it consistent with God's word? Is it fitting in terms of God's view of people and how they were designed? So in that regard, am I able to bring that Christian worldview to bear on it and still have it be appropriate, right? And something that I can use in a Christian way or from a Christian framework. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so
Mhm.
I think based on your comments, you kind of lean toward this integration approach. Tell us a little bit more about why you prefer that, and tell us just a little bit more. Maybe you can give us a couple examples of how you go about this integration approach.
Yeah. So for me, it's kind of, the idea of all truth is God's truth, right? So whatever field we're talking about, the goal is to say, okay, if it's actually true, then obviously it's of God. So whether that's something I discover, in science through physics, or whether that's something I discover through my research into mental health or whatever we're doing, if it's true, then it's actually going to be consistent with God's word and God's view of how he made things and how they work. So that's really what we mean by integration. We're trying to make sure that alignment is there. So for me, the reason I'm again lean in this direction is because of that idea of all truth being God's truth, and that's the goal in terms of our discernment. But also that people are complex, right? We're body, soul, and spirit. We're not just one. God made us that way. We have bodies that will be glorified someday. We're not disconnected people. Those aspects of ourselves are integrated and are all functioning at the same time together. We're not separate in terms of those pieces of us. They're interconnected. And we're also people that are living in a certain context that, like you were talking about, the impact of college on young people and how easy it is to buy into things. That's certainly true, not only culturally, but in terms of family environments or different cultures. And we're also developmental. God designed us to grow physically, emotionally, spiritually. It doesn't all happen in a day. So when you think about integrating your faith into counseling or trying to help people grow, you have to think about people more holistically and more integrated in terms of how God designed us and the way change works. So for me, all theories, whatever that theory is, comes with some assumptions about how change actually works. And that's, of course, going to also be based on the ontology of what it means to be human, what it means to be a person. And all of those are biblical worldview issues that we need to think through and again say, does this fit from a biblical worldview perspective?
So, just to even drill down on that a little bit more and bring out some things that you're saying there, is a critical assumption that we have as historic Christians is that, humanity is sinful.
Hmm.
We do not look at the human person. We do not approach the average human person with great optimism about their ability to take responsibility or change. We kind of have a realistic view of the human person, that they are sinners and that somehow, they are participating in sin on some level, and that we may be dealing in the therapy context, in some cases, not all, but in some, consequences of sin. And when I don't know, I'm pretty sure I've said this publicly, that many years ago, like 20 years ago, I spent several months in a psychiatric hospital. And so I lived through a lot of group therapy, and I went through a lot of therapists, and so saw a lot of different personalities. And one thing I noticed is, like, the thing that we're not talking about here in this group is people's sinful participation in how they got here. We're talking about, healing, but we're not talking about the real problem of my participation in how I got arrested, or how I've lost custody of my kids, or how I've been arrested for domestic violence, or whatever. That in this large group that I was in, people just had different problems. My problem was none of those things. I had my own problems, but there wasn't a conversation about our fundamental defectiveness as human persons. That has a major impact. That's a worldview issue that has a major impact on change and transformation. I don't know, maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up. That's really important, again, from a Christian worldview, regardless of whether we're talking about counseling or some of these other things that you guys address, in the Center for Biblical Unity, that one of our core assumptions is that we are fallen, and that we have a flesh and a sinful nature, and that even as Christians, even though we have the Holy Spirit helping us overcome that and produce better fruit, we are still in the process of not only working through that in terms of our own personal sin struggles or tendencies, but also the impact of sin on just who we are. We believe in total depravity, right? We believe that it affects our minds, our bodies, our spirit, our world. And so again, I think that's when I think about integration, is really making sure that we're considering how all of that is playing out from a Christian worldview, as well as some of these other things. We can be both sinned against as well as commit sins of our own.
Yeah,
so we need to be, again, approaching people as, again, those whole integrated people, and how that looks from a biblical point of view, I think. So
when we say the phrase, and I got to tell you, Dr. King, I'm not a fan of the phrase "all truth is God's truth." Just not a fan. But I understand the sentiment behind it, as long as we're clear about the standard that we're using to get to the truth. And I think maybe I just have some negative experiences where that phrase has been used to co-sign on very unbiblical ideas and worldview assumptions. And so I want to just offer that as a caveat of my own prejudice against that phrase. But I understand the heart behind what you're saying, and I know you well enough to know that you're saying, yeah, my standard for truth is the biblical worldview. And I do want to let people know really quick about an ebook that we're offering tonight from Dr. King, that summarizes a lot of the ideas that we're going to be sharing tonight. You can go download it at allthethingshow.com/king. It's a special page that I set up just for tonight. And I'll leave it up for a couple of weeks as the podcast gets pushed out. But you can sign up for a free ebook. Just go to allthethingshow.com/king. And when you go there and you sign up, you're going to subscribe to our weekly Friday show preview. You'll get that in your email box each week. And you're going to get Dr. King's ebook, The Essential Guide to Finding the Right Christian Counselor. It's an awesome little ebook that's going to detail a lot of the things we're talking about tonight, and then some other issues about giving you a rubric for how to vet a Christian counselor. What are the questions I should ask? even a rubric for how to score the person's answers. It's going to be very practical and helpful for you. All right, Monique, why don't you jump in? I've been trying to just lay the worldview groundwork here.
I was just waiting my turn.
I
Just
know,
waiting
I
my
know.
turn. Here we are. Okay, so let's talk about some of the just on the ground practical stuff. So when I think back to when I lived in South Africa, the word trauma, and even before then, the word trauma had some very specific meanings and parameters. You can look in the DSM. I think when I was in school, it was like the DSM-3 maybe. And so I can look and I can see, well, this is trauma and all of these things, even though they may be painful and horrible and very sad, that is outside of the realm of what we would call trauma. Now, when we think about trauma historically, trauma started out as being something that was physical, but now has moved into the realm of the mental health space. Part of what I'm seeing recently, I'd say over the last maybe 4, 5, 6 years, is this idea of trauma being outside of, things that used to be very concrete or objective to being things that are very subjective. That was traumatic for me. I saw the American flag. That was traumatic. Or my teacher used this word in class. That was traumatizing. Or some universities telling their professors that they need to give trauma trigger warnings because if you're going to use this word obese, for example, that's the newest one that's circulating around our culture right now. Well, if you're going to use the word obese, then you should give a trauma warning because that is a traumatic word for some. Does it, like, am I making this up? Like, is the definition of trauma in culture changing? I don't think that, professionally, maybe that word isn't changing, but maybe it is. Maybe there are some clinicians who are now shifting their thought around the word trauma to be something less objective and more subjective. What are you noticing? And then even before that, sorry, help us just define trauma,
Yeah.
because there are so many definitions that are floating around.
Sure. Well, first of all, again, I want to thank you, Krista, for even jumping in about that comment about the all truth is God's truth, because one of the reasons I'm really thankful that you're letting me have this conversation is because there's so much confusion around mental health topics and terminology. Monique's always asking, define that term, and that is the world we're living in. And it's especially confusing in this world of mental health, not only because we're Christians trying to figure this out, but because there are so many theories, so many models, so many perspectives on these things that it becomes very confusing very quickly. So I certainly hope that anybody listening to this conversation tonight hears that. And again, the goal here is to try to be discerning and to make sure we are trying to be true to what God's word has to say about Christian worldview and how to apply this. So again, thank you for clarifying that. For a trauma perspective, absolutely, historically, the PTSD really originated with post-war veterans, people coming back from battle. So historically, trauma has been about that in terms of identifying those symptoms and reactions that people in very, war zone type of situations were experiencing. So historically, that's really what the DSM-5, which is the Statistical Manual for Mental Health Disorders, categorizes things as, in terms of trauma. PTSD is about your life or someone else's life being at risk, and you either having experienced it yourself or witnessed it in some kind of direct way. And there is some allowance for them to say, like, also maybe a close friend or family member had that trauma and you are kind of, hearing it from them or experiencing it kind of vicariously because of them can also produce symptoms. But the symptoms that go with it are also very clear and specific. And a lot of them are very, again, related to physical components like Monique was mentioning. So that's the historical context. More broadly and more generally, you can think about trauma as those things that overwhelm someone's ability to cope and that have a long-lasting impact. And again, that could be different for somebody that's 2 years old versus 12 years old versus, 52 years old. But the idea is that your system and your ability to cope are being overwhelmed, and therefore you're really at the core having a fear response, an overwhelming fear response, that's creating ultimately some of these symptoms of trauma, both physically and emotionally. Another thing to keep in mind, though, with trauma is that there's also different ways, again, of looking at it because of those other factors that come into play. So in general, you're thinking about it in terms of similar to like an emergency room, like a trauma center there. Why would you go to a trauma center? Because you've got a life-threatening thing happening. That's kind of the equivalent emotionally to what we think of historically as trauma. So we want to think about trauma, though, also in terms of frequency, duration, and intensity. So, one horrible event is bad and can produce trauma symptoms, but it's possible that that event lasted a long time or a short amount of time, or maybe similar events that were overwhelming emotionally, or overwhelming my ability to cope. Maybe they happened more than once. And what was the level of intensity, right? So those factors of frequency, duration, and intensity are always going to also affect what kind of end result that people have, amongst other things. But those are important things to think about. And especially when we think about children experiencing these things, there's people who kind of focus on that it can be complex trauma or developmental trauma in the sense that they're experiencing events and conditions that are overwhelming to their ability to cope on some kind of regular basis while they're growing up and while they're just trying to kind of survive in that environment. And that's where we think about some of the traumatic childhood stuff, abuse and neglect and other things that can have a long-lasting impact. I look at things from a spectrum, that trauma is really kind of on one end of the spectrum, and that there's lots of other kinds of emotional wounds that people can experience that are less than the definition of trauma, but it doesn't mean they're not important or they haven't had an impact. But we're not going to diagnose them as PTSD. I'm not going to call them trauma, but they are still emotional wounds, and we have to think about those as well and say, okay, are they emotional wounds equivalent to, falling off a bike and scraping your knee, or to getting hit by a bus, right? Those are two very different things. And so part of the job of a good therapist is to help sort that out and not put everything into one category, and really help people identify and work through whatever the results were of the level of experiences that they had.
There are, very concrete ways, like I said earlier, very concrete ways in which people have historically defined, oh, this is a traumatic event. Like the ACEs score that for children, adverse childhood experiences, and looking at a score like that standard or that survey of experiences really looks at concrete things. Has a child had a parent go to jail? Has the child had a death of a parent? Or have they seen the death of a parent? Has there been a near-death experience for them? Like, have they been in a severe car accident? Or something like that, where they had something physical happen to them. And so these are very concrete and severe things that could potentially create trauma in that person. So what I think Krista's hitting on is the idea that today we can see some things, or on social media or in our culture, like people complaining about the flag, or complaining because they heard a word, or complaining because someone said something to them, and they'll now define that as trauma. But what does that do to people who have had very severe events?
Mhm.
And is it all just now lumped in this bucket of trauma?
Yeah. Well, and that's again one of the things I'm trying to highlight a little bit of too, is again, there's a spectrum, right, of emotional wounds. So again, I think it's more helpful to talk about most things in the context of emotional wounds. I'm not here to lie or be dishonest or deny that you felt hurt about something, or experienced an emotional wound, whether it's minor or major. But the question is does it really qualify as trauma, from a clinical standpoint, right?
Yeah.
So again, I think it's good that we can have that conversation. I don't need to be black and white about it. I just want to make sure I'm looking at things from a more accurate lens of what is actually true, right? Not dumping everything into a bucket of trauma. I do agree that that word is being overused now. We're kind of living in a culture that's become very psychologized. Um, Having a mental health diagnosis is almost a badge of honor for a lot of people in some ways. Not everybody, but there are people out there where it's like that's a good thing now, or a way to kind of identify with a certain group. And I'm not saying it's not real, but it's just taken on its own life in some ways in our culture, right, to around mental health issues. So again, I just want to be careful as a Christian that I'm being truthful about, is whatever it is it true or is it not true? It's a really
Yeah.
important question for Christians to be asking. And we're living in a culture that's really overemphasizing victimization and oppression and safety, right? And again, those are real things. They happen in real life to real people. And they very much matter in different circumstances. But when we overemphasize it, then we're encouraging people to kind of think this way or adopt a mentality or identify as traumatized when maybe that's not really true. So I think there are people that are using the word in just more casual ways, it's just become colloquial to say, oh, that traumatized me. And that's not really what they mean. So it's just kind of a new catchphrase or something. I still don't think that's necessarily helpful, but we do that all the time with different types of words. And then there are people that are using it in very intentional ways in terms of to elicit sympathy of some kind or to help, get support for a particular agenda by trying to get people to empathize with them by saying that they've been traumatized by it. And so that's something we should also be aware of in terms of how language is being used in the culture.
Sorry, I didn't realize I was muted. I think that's really important to understand how the word trauma is being used in the culture and what it can mean when a word like trauma is overused or overemphasized, or when young people especially are in some regards encouraged to see things as being traumatic.
Yeah.
When you have a whole culture that now says, well, all of these things are traumatic, what does that do for your like inner strength? Like, how does that maybe create a weaker or a softer generation?
Yeah, I think ironically, again, I'm been a counselor, social worker, therapist, my whole adult life. And so obviously I care very much about people who are struggling with real emotional issues and continue to help people like that on a weekly basis. These things matter to me, but which is why truth is also really important here. I'm not going to be helpful to you if I'm not actually dealing with actual reality, but I'm overemphasizing something in a way that isn't true or exaggerating it, right? So when we exaggerate words like trauma from a mental health perspective, we're actually contributing to a culture of what therapists calls cognitive distortions or unrealistic or unreasonable ways of looking at things that actually increase mental health problems. So the more I catastrophize something and make it worse than it actually was, I'm going to have more anxiety. I'm going to feel more out of control. I'm going to feel more insecure, right? Because that's what I now believe, and what we believe really matters. So part of, again, what we want to do is be helping people to not do that and to really have a realistic and reasonable way of looking at life. Now, if you've truly been traumatized like you were with a life-threatening situation, then I'm not going to minimize that, right? I'm going to say that is really what happened, and how do we move forward?
Yeah.
But there are other people that, they're coming in with things that aren't really traumas, and it's cognitive distortions that's feeding that, and we have to work on that.
Oh, that everything you just said reminds me. I'm reading the Calling of the American Mind, and what the authors talk about is the upsurge of peanut allergies. I think that happened in like the mid 80s and early 90s, something like that, where at one point in time, there were only like 4 children out of 1,000 who had a peanut allergy. And when they did the study again, that number had grown to about 14 to 15 kids out of 1,000. What the research showed was that because parents were sending their kids to schools that sheltered kids from peanuts themselves, their immune system wasn't able to do what the immune system does to be able to build up a defense against peanuts if they were to eventually have developed the allergy. And so what they did was they got 2 groups of students. They gave one students from like 4 months through 11 months peanuts, things that contain peanuts. And then the other group of kids, 4 months to 11 months, they kept away from peanuts. Well, the kids who never were exposed to peanuts actually had more allergies to peanuts than the kids who actually were exposed. I think it was 3% of the kids who were exposed developed a peanut allergy, yet 17% of the kids who were not exposed developed this peanut allergy. I say all this to say what you're saying reminds me of this study, because it's like, what are we being exposed to? Are we being exposed to things that can really help help us gird up our inner man, or help us to actually become emotionally strengthened? Or
The
are
word
we
that
being
comes to me,
sheltered?
the word that comes to me is resilient.
Yes,
Yeah.
that is the word.
What are we doing to
Like,
build up our resilience?
yes. And so, like, you can look up resiliency studies and see that there's a very small percentage of the population that's naturally resilient. It's something like 4% of all the people on the planet are naturally resilient. And so what do you do with this other percentage of the population that is not naturally resilient? Is it right or in line with building up resiliency to shelter them from things that could in some ways help to create more of a resiliency within them? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, again, that's why I think this conversation is so important, especially from the church. Um, we can sit here all day long and say you should be resilient, you should have these abilities. The Bible says so. I mean, and again, I would agree with lots of stuff. The question is always, how do you get there, right? And if you have these weaknesses, whether of your own choosing or not, how do I help you develop those skills and abilities and internal resiliencies in order to not struggle with those things? And as our culture again becomes more anxious, we all know there's kind of an epidemic of mental health struggles and anxiety and other things for a variety of reasons. How do we meet people where they are and help them move forward in that journey of healing and growth and sanctification and those things to be more resilient, to be stronger, to produce more fruits of the Spirit and less fruits of all this other stuff, right? So, and not talking about it isn't going to help. And I think we have to have, again, what I always think of is a theory of change, right? If my theory of change, whether that's, whether I think it's biblical or not, isn't actually biblical, it's not going to work.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of these theories, again, that we learn in psychology, again, it's not that there's not some truth to them. The question is there enough truth to it?
Mm-hmm.
Does it capture the whole picture? And am I using them in the right way and the right order to actually help you get somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And again, one of the things that is important to me is that we tend to be very reductionistic about some of this stuff and want to oversimplify the solution to some mental health problems.
Well, before you get into that, let's take a quick break and hear from our friends at Harvest House about the Unshaken conference, and then we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit more about resourcing and just more about. I'd love to hear a little bit more about change and what you see as being some of the important components to change. So we'll talk about all of that on the other side of the break.
Unshaken 2024 is coming. Join 3 of the most influential voices in cultural apologetics, Natasha Crane, Frank Turek, and Elisa Childers, as they equip Christians to live for Jesus in a world increasingly at odds with biblical Christianity. At Unshaken, you will join hundreds of others who are seeking to navigate the intersection of societal pressure and biblical truth, covering topics such as deconstruction, social justice, sexuality, and many more. Unshaken will teach you what the Bible has already said about the social issues we face today, and equip you to stand firm in God's truth. The Unshaken Conference will be visiting Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, New York, and Austin, Texas in 2024. For details and tickets, visit unshakenconference.com and use code FRIEND20 to get 20% off your ticket price. Join us this year for an experience that will embolden and encourage your faith. That's code FRIEND20 at unshakenconference.com. We'll see you there.
All right. And I saw Dr. King and I got to meet each other in person at the Unshaken Conference in Detroit. That was kind of fun. And Monique and I are planning to be at the Buffalo, New York conference in September. So get your tickets now. You can use that promo code FRIEND20 and get a discount for that. Okay. I think that it would be good, Dr. King, just to talk about some of these reductionistic concerns that you have and, how that plays into our ability to change and, some of the problems and maybe even just define what you mean. Give us some examples of reductionistic issues.
The key aspects of worldview, right? Because thinking about that from a Christian worldview is what do we assume the problem is, and therefore what do we assume the solution is? So we were talking earlier about the importance of really looking at things from that standpoint of sin, not only personal sin, but also how does sin play out in other areas of life, whether it's relational impact, genetic impact, even on potential things. Biological, sin is pervasive, and that's why we believe in total depravity. So that's what I mean by not being reductionistic, to just focus on one aspect of a person and say that's the only source of the problem is usually not correct, especially when it comes to a variety of mental health symptoms. There's, again, I use the biblical metaphor of the tree that Jesus talks about, that the scripture talks about throughout, as this picture of people that are growing and producing fruits of righteousness and the fruits of the Spirit. So if a tree isn't producing good fruit, I can't just say to the tree, well, I don't like your fruit, so tomorrow I want different fruit, right? There's reasons why that fruit is being produced, certainly spiritual reasons, and also sometimes the interplay of other reasons that are making that fruit be produced. So again, when you have true trauma, and I've been impacted emotionally and physically by that, I don't have direct control over the fact that those symptoms are, and that fruit is being produced in my life. What I need to do is step back and say, okay, how do I deal with the different components that are feeding and creating this fruit in order to have it diminish or reduce or go away? So when I say reductionistic, it's usually kind of an assumption that one thing is the primary source of the problem, whether that's, well, it's just medical. So there's been conversation recently again about, kind of debunking the fact that there's this idea of chemical imbalance, right? Well, okay, on some level, that's fine, but I still don't believe that your brain isn't impacted by trauma. That doesn't mean we understand it all. That doesn't mean that these medications are always the right solution or that they're going to magically fix it. But reductionism would say, well, that doesn't matter anymore. There's absolutely no effect on the brain of mental health. I don't think that's actually true. Or it might be, again, the spiritual component where somebody's got a sin pattern or a sin struggle. And of course, there's a spiritual component. Of course, there may be even struggling not to make certain choices to repeat a certain pattern or addiction. But to say that it's only a spiritual problem, again, for me, is to say that that that's, a one-dimensional solution, or that people aren't whole people that have bodies, minds, and spirits all working together at the same time, and that there might be other aspects of this that I need to address in order to help you overcome that sin problem, right? So reductionism to me is, again, oversimplifying and focusing only on one thing. And one of the common things in our culture that's part of this stuff that you guys talk about is the externalizing of everything. Well, it's something outside of me that's the problem. And if that were just fixed, if I weren't oppressed anymore, or if I were just affirmed in certain ways. And again, it doesn't mean those things aren't real, or real in certain places or times. It just means that it's overly simplified. It's not the whole truth. And so yeah. And then that becomes a problem from a mental health standpoint, because if I'm not operating from a place of actual truth and I am oversimplifying something, then it's probably not going to help me in the long run.
Part of this conversation on reductionism, or this whole reductionistic technique, makes me think of the conversation about race. And a lot of what I've seen in regards to like racial trauma and race as being the central part of therapy and things like that, all the way down to the idea that a Black person should have a Black therapist, an Asian person should have an Asian therapist. Would you say that that's just being too reductionistic, or is there like, I don't know. And let me just ask, what do you think about that?
So I'll give a two-pronged answer in kind of response to both of those things. And again, my qualification is I'm not an expert in studying race-based trauma. I can give the broader perspective, and for me, again, I think that putting any diagnosis like trauma, again, is supposed to be a diagnosis in terms of, are you actually traumatized? Putting that into an identity or group category is dangerous from a Christian worldview. We're all human with unique individuals affected by and responding to specific experiences in different ways and for a variety of reasons. And to just make that about someone's race or ethnicity, to me, is conflating things that aren't necessarily helpful. And so I think we have to be careful about that. There are certainly things that are common for people groups living in different locations or cultures or socioeconomic situations and experiences that they're having that are going to impact them, of course. But trauma itself is more complex and individualized than that to me. And I can't determine whether you have trauma unless I talk to you personally. I can't just assume that everybody in a certain context is traumatized. It's something that's individual. So that's why I think that can also be reductionistic, because I'm oversimplifying again that this is the source of the problem, and it may be part of it, but that doesn't mean that it's the only source. So discrimination is real. It happens. It can affect people. Of course, I want to consider that as part of what someone's struggling with, but the term race-based trauma to me feels taking things a little too far in terms of how it's being used. But so when it comes to that idea again of what was the second part of the question? I'm sorry, I lost you there with the racial piece of it.
Just, should ethnicity play a part in looking for a therapist? So like, because I'm Black, should I be looking for a Black therapist?
Yeah, so I do think that there are times and places where, we want to have somebody that we feel like understands us. So there could be a time and a place when pursuing a therapist that is of your ethnicity or of your gender, I think that could have its place. But to me, that's still not the primary focus as a Christian. So as a Christian, I want somebody who can help walk me through, again, the truth and from a biblical worldview, and who understands my biblical worldview and can really guide me in that way, and that I know is going to actually help me to be able to heal. And even if they're not a Christian, are they operating in a way, are they, like a doctor? Do they have the skills and the abilities to actually help me to heal? That's more important to me than your gender or your skin color. But again, that doesn't mean that there aren't times and places that might not be something that somebody finds helpful, but I don't think that's the key factor in people healing. I work with people of all ethnicities. I live in a very multicultural area, and even if the person sitting in front of me was another, middle-aged white man from the Midwest, I still don't know that person until I don't know what they believe. I don't know how their particular experience has affected them until I ask them, and then I have to still work within whatever that cultural context they bring is. But from my viewpoint, again, God's truth transcends culture in terms of helping people to be healthy and heal from a lot of things. It doesn't have to do with that. It has to do with how God made us in his image and how we get affected by this stuff, regardless of where we live.
I can imagine that the issue of ethnicity, and I prefer to think of it more as culture, may be a helpful thing, especially if there's things that could be part of my healing journey that culture has had a major impact in. It could be helpful to see a therapist who we share the same culture, and we're both kind of cultural insiders and having some shared understandings, even unspoken understandings. Are like, yeah, I get it. I could see how
easier.
Yeah, how that could potentially be useful.
But something that we tend to say at the Center for Biblical Unity is that skin color doesn't always equate to culture.
Right.
And so just because I find a Black therapist doesn't mean that my therapist grew up in an inner city for, a good portion of their childhood like I did.
Right.
Or it could be that the white therapist, just happened to grow up socioeconomically deprived and, might have more in common with me and understand some of the street culture or the culture of the hood, or, however you want to phrase that, more than somebody who even shares my skin color. And so I think, while Krista, I think 100%, yes, you're absolutely right in saying that, sometimes those things, the cultural connection is really important. Dr. King, I like how you put it too about the individual and understanding the individual, and is this individual, who is the individual in front of me?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? As opposed to some of the other things that I see being put on the scene in culture. Go ahead, Krista.
Yeah. While we're on the topic of choosing a therapist, we want to restate something we said at the top of the show, and that is, even if you talk to somebody who calls themselves a Christian counselor, you have to ask deeper questions because they may or may not have an integrated worldview. There's a comment on Facebook from Megan to that effect of just, she's had a lot of different counselors, and she has a very strong biblical worldview. She's been to licensed Christian counselors, non-Christian counselors who said they were Christians but didn't seem to have a biblical worldview. So when we're in that search for a counselor, let's talk a little bit about what are some things for people to look for. And I also want to mention again, the ebook that we're giving away tonight on the show. Just go to allthethingshow.com/king, and we're going to give you as a free download Dr. King's very helpful ebook that has a lot of questions in it to help you vet a potential Christian counselor. But maybe, Dr. King, you can give us a few things to look for when we're looking for a counselor.
Yeah, so again, I would certainly just start with, what's their training and educational background? Again, did you go to a state school? Did you go to a Christian university? Which one was it? Again, people come from a variety of different Christian traditions as well. So maybe if they tell you they went to a certain university that was of a certain denomination, that'll tell you something, and maybe that's your thing, or maybe it's not, right? And so that's still important in terms of you trying to make sure you understand what is your training and educational background, from a Christian standpoint or not, but also clinically. Tell me about what your program entailed, or what your areas of expertise are, where you've kind of gotten additional certifications or things like that. So that's an important question to ask of any therapist, but also certainly Christian therapists. What's their theoretical and clinical approach? Again, that'll help you to hear from them whether they're going to explain something that includes a biblical worldview, or whether it's just a certain set of secular theories. And again, that doesn't mean all those theories are bad or unhelpful. It just means, what does that mean from my Christian worldview standpoint, and how that's going to fit in, and how are we going to talk about that or not, if that's important to you. And depending on the theory that they're using or that they're focusing on, again, are its assumptions about change and about people and about how the world works consistent with a biblical worldview? It's, again, a really important question. And some parts of it might be, and some parts of it might not. So, for example, there's been a very popular treatment approach called dialectical behavioral therapy now, around for 20, 25 years now. And it originally was focused very much on people with borderline personality disorder. Yeah, which is a very difficult thing for people, and it often includes a history of trauma. So again, there's lots of helpful techniques that come along with that particular theory that are kind of neutral and benign, and could certainly be used from a Christian standpoint, or just helpful in terms of managing symptoms. But the entire theory is rooted in Eastern philosophy. And so that's where we want to be careful. I don't want to just adopt everything about DBT because someone says it's an evidence-based practice. And it is, according to, the NIH or other places where, it's got research behind it to say it has some effectiveness. Okay. Again, that's the part for me where I want to say, okay, are there good things to keep? Are there bad things I shouldn't be doing, or things that aren't biblical? And what does this mean, in terms of me practicing this particular approach? We just want to be discerning about that kind of stuff. And I would want my therapist to be discerning about that kind of stuff if I'm looking for a Christian therapist. And that's true of a lot of things. Just because something's evidence-based doesn't mean it's coming with a Christian worldview. And what does that mean about how we want to approach therapy? So that kind of leads into just what is their theological perspective? Again, some of the things we talked about earlier. And again, one or more of those might be more important to you. Like I said, I'm not here to bash them all, especially, even the isolationist one where it's more just focused on the Bible. Okay, that might be what you need right now, or that might be important to you. And that's fine, but just kind of know what you're getting, right? And kind of know how that fits into what you're looking for and what you're trying to recover from or heal from. So what is their approach to that integration of faith and practice? And then probably just the last thing I'll mention again is what we just talked about is really more style and fit, right? So that might be appropriate at times to say, hey, I really want a therapist that's my own gender, or a therapist that has a similar ethnic background for some valid reason. And that would be fine. And then other times you might say, if that's really not the part of style and fit that's most important to me, or that I really need. And so what does that look like in terms of the kind of Christian therapist that I'm looking for? So I hope that's helpful. And again, I hope this booklet is helpful in terms of thinking it through. This can be a complex process. And so that's kind of the purpose of the booklet, is to say, you have to decide, but here's the tools to help make that a good decision for you.
I think it's so helpful in looking at, so many questions that can be asked and things to think about. Your booklet has many areas or questions to consider when looking for a therapist that we have not even been able to scratch the surface on today.
Yeah.
And so I have not seen a resource like it. And so I am thankful that you have created this, that you've taken your time to put all of this together. And so I encourage all of you to go and sign up. One, you're signing up for our weekly newsletter, or All the Things newsletter, but also you will get Dr. King's very thorough booklet on, what should I be looking for? What questions should I ask? How do I rate this therapist? And so it's just extremely helpful. Dr. King, I have one last question because we've talked a lot about practitioners, we talked a lot about trauma and all this. My question is, how do I know when I'm being a good client? Or, how should I show up to the therapy room? Now let's say I've selected my therapist. I believe we're going to be a good fit. And, what posture should I hold, or what are some ways that I can participate for my own healing?
Wow, what a great question. I don't think I've ever been asked that before.
It was
Um,
Krista's. I can't lie.
Well,
I
to
just
me,
kind of threw it
that's
in there
the,
like it was mine.
I'll just say, I think that's the key to therapy. I mean, even if you, okay, in my experience, I am a big advocate of firing your therapist if it's not working.
Don't
Like,
play no games.
it's kind of like a dating relationship. You go for a little while, you got to be a good team. But you also need a therapist that'll tell you the truth about yourself. And that is hard to find. So if you're lying to yourself, you don't want a therapist who's just going to confirm all your lies. And that to me is like such an important aspect of a therapist that I can work with. I have to have somebody who's going to tell me the truth. And they're not going to be afraid of all my strong opinions and all of this, that they're just going to tell me the truth. But then conversely, I think that why I had so much success in therapy is that I was on my game every week. Like, I'm paying a lot of money for this. I want to tell the truth to myself. And I want to get to the bottom of whatever this problem is, like the sin done to me or the sin that I'm participating in as a result of the sin done to me. That, like, I have to be on my game. And to me, therapy, the best therapy is a bunch of truth telling. And so it's my question, because when people tell me, oh, I tried therapy, it didn't work, my immediate question is, well, how did you show up? What did you do? Or did you think that that therapist is going to be some magical fairy that was going to wave a magic wand and take all your problems away? No, you got to bring it each and every time of
yeah.
something. So I don't know. That's my mindset.
Yeah. No, I really appreciate that. And that's why you'd be a great client. Because, that's not how most people show up, but I appreciate you giving that advice. And that's partly why it's important to try to pick a good therapist and sort through this as a Christian, because I don't expect everybody to know how therapy works or what they're supposed to do, or it's like going to the doctor. You're hoping for some guidance, some advice, and you're trusting this person to steer you in the right direction. And also, people come at different levels of their woundedness and readiness to change, or ability to change yet. And so certainly I always want to meet people where they are, and help lead them toward those next steps. But again, for me, that's an intentional process. Like, after we assess things and kind of know what's going on, like, I kind of know where some things need to go, right? And I'm going to help either tell you the truth, like Krista's saying, or I'm going to be asking a lot of questions to try to get you to see the truth and to start moving in that direction. And that might include tools, that might include, different things I give you to help you learn things, to start to put those pieces together and make progress. But that's, again, a style of therapy. And I have my style. It's not the only style. But again, I believe, again, that, it's my job to help you get somewhere, not just kind of rehash everything for however long, right? We're here to grow and to try to achieve some healing and change. So yeah, does that help?
Yeah, but so much of that, you're bringing up so many great points, and I know we got to sign off, but I just want to encourage people, like, to ask questions. And I think that this is vital, because I'd love to have you on again, Dr. King, and just talk more about your model for change, and just do
That'd
a
be
whole
great.
show on that, because I think that would also help people know how to vet someone who can help them, and just to
Yeah.
even think about, like, a goal or a trajectory in therapy, that Yeah, sometimes telling the story over and over does have a healing effect, and having somebody listen. But there also comes a point where you need somebody to point the way out. Like, where's the door where I can now exit this pain? And
Hmm.
what does that look like? And what you don't want is a therapist who just will always affirm everything that you do and say, because that to me is the on-ramp to progressive ideology. Like, for many people, going to therapy is a big part of deconstruction.
Yeah. For me, again, I'd love to come back. Again, I have a very specific model. I'd be happy to share that as a handout too, if you want to
Yeah.
use it. But again, for me, when I approach faith integration, again, this is sanctification. If you're a Christian, this is sanctification. It's not just counseling, right? This should be a way to be growing and becoming more like Christ and producing better fruit in
Mm.
your life for your own emotional health and stability, but also so that you have more to give away and share with the world and more of the love of Christ and more of God's righteousness, right? That's the goal of therapy for a Christian. It's just to me, a very intentional discipleship process, kind of specific to you and some of your areas of needs or healing or growth. Um, that's the goal in the long run, right, for a Christian. So
That's really good.
It is. There are two questions on YouTube that I want to go to really quickly before we sign off. And the first one is from Elaine Voss, and she says, how much overlap or expertise is fair to expect in receiving counsel from your pastor? Is this something that they can be trained for?
that's a really great question. And
Elaine's
again,
kind of perfect like that. I'm just saying, you need to know Elaine.
yeah. Well, again, and that's, obviously, fully support pastors, and they have a job of shepherding people. But it is not fair to expect them to be mental health experts, or to be couples counseling experts or those types of things. Some of them do a very good job, or, have a much broader understanding that they can bring to the table. But oftentimes, they're not going to be able to provide more than a few sessions, or again, their focus is going to, again, be predominantly spiritual, which again is fine. That's their wheelhouse, right? But I would just, again, want to pursue, if you've got deeper, longer lasting struggles or painful experiences you're working from your past, most often you really need to pursue some other type of uh, components of that healing journey, whether it's therapy, whether it's a good Christian recovery group, other varieties of things, that kind of thing. And that's partly why, I offer the program I offer too, because churches don't have the capacity in a lot of places to deal with this stuff well, even if they want to. So
Yeah.
Yeah.
it's not shame on the church. It's just that there's limited resources, right?
Yeah. Yes. And
We got to sign off. You can't be going down any more rabbit trails.
I'm not going down no rabbit holes. I was going to say something, you know what? And I am going to say it. Sometimes it's best when people stay in their lanes. That's my personal opinion. You can take it or leave it. But I do think that being trained in mental health work is different than being trained in pastoral ministries. Now, you might be a great pastoral counselor, but if you're trained in the homily and somebody else is trained in counseling, my personal opinion is to allow people to live in the lanes that they study, the lanes that God has gifted them in. And that's kind of what I think I hear you saying. But yeah, I personally think that, counseling is a very specific skill. And when not done well, can also harm and bring damage. And so this is why I'm an encourager of allowing people to live in the lane that they're in. The last question is from Jenny's getting inky with it. And it says, given what is going on in schools, etc., is the age of the counselor's practice being taken into consideration? I think what she means is like, I came straight out of getting my PhD in, counseling and mental health and all that. or, I'm a MSW and I got my degree a year ago and now I have my own practice. Should I be considering that, or should a potential client consider the age of my practice, looking at me as a new person versus someone who's seasoned like you are, Dr. King, and, maybe didn't go through as much indoctrination as someone who more recently graduated?
Yeah, not to throw my own graduates under the bus. But experience does matter, right? And certainly one of the things we try to do to the best of our ability in our program is to provide enough framework to give you the tools to get a good start, right? And again, for me, I always tell people that I'm training as counselors, counseling is about critical thinking as much as it's about specific skill sets. Again, I'm not here to just put one size fits all technique onto everybody. And that's why if I come back, I'll share my more kind of bigger picture model. If we think about people well, and our detectives and helping to listen to the Holy Spirit in what we need to be doing, then we're going to approach the process differently.
Yeah.
And we're never going to know everything, but we can still be helpful and bring the right tools to bear. And again, what I find more often is that people who lack experience, that's just what they're, and I did it too. So I'm not, when I was early on, I'm like, which tool do I grab from my toolbox this week? Because I have no idea what to do. And so you're just going to get a little bit more of that, smorgasbord approach, because they're just not, they're not cohesive yet on exactly what they're doing and how they're doing it. And so,
Dr. King, as we round out here, why don't you tell us about the organization that you and our friend Kim Parker and Kat Elias are part of, the Association of Christians in Health and Human Services, and the work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so another organization that I'm involved with, as Krista just said, is the Association of Christians in Health and Human Services. It's a long title, but it's just achhs.org. And it is an organization specifically for Christian human services professionals, which certainly includes counselors and therapists and social workers, but other health professions too. Largely started for those of us who were becoming disheartened and discouraged by some of our other Christian professional organizations who were really going woke and buying into a lot of the social justice ideology and, again, unbiblical kind of frameworks and views of the world, and making that their priority instead of actual biblical faith integration and having conversations about what that needs to look like in practice. And unfortunately, there are just way too many organizations, including medical and mental health, that are adopting these principles and even forcing them on people in terms of licensure and other things. And so this is a way of, carving out a space to bring Christians who care about a biblical worldview together to support one another, and also do some training and workshops, have a conference and things like that to really help meet that need. So.
Yeah, that's
Dr.
great.
King, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that Monique and I have had the privilege of being able to do a webinar for your group. And, so if people are working professionally in those areas, they can get connected there. Go ahead, Monique.
I was just going to say, Dr. King, please tell us about your website, how we can follow your work or get connected with you. And again, everyone, if you have not already, go and download Dr. King's free ebook. You can do that right through our All the Things website. We will put the slide up for that at the end of the show. But how can we get in contact with you, Dr. King?
Yeah, again, the easiest way is go to healingourpainfulexperiences.com. It'll tell you a little bit about me, and then again, you can sign up for an email, or it has my email address on that page if you want to get in touch with me without getting on the email list. But it's just information, again, partly about the master class and on trauma recovery for Christians that I offer. And some of the coaching that I do. That's the easiest way. You can also just Google IWU or Indiana Wesleyan University MSW program. And if you can find that, there's a faculty page with a picture of me that looks much younger and better, that you can find me at. So
Again, it's healingourpainfulexperiences.com.
Yeah, and it's
correct.
in the
Yep.
booklet. So if people download the ebook, they can go to allthethingshow.com/King, and you can get Dr. King's bio is in there, his website is in there, and you can find out more about his work and get connected to him. Also, thanks to our moderators for putting those links in the chat. And we want to help resource people. I look forward to having you on again, Dr.
Yes.
King, and continuing the conversation. People are saying in the chat they want you to come back, and they have found this to be a good, helpful step into the mental health discussion. And let's continue that conversation. So thanks for being with us.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'm very grateful. Hope to see you again.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. That was good.
Yeah, that was good. It was long, but I think, I appreciate Dr. King's heart and just wanting to bring the biblical worldview into his profession, and also just wanting to really care for people. He's such an authentic guy and just brother in the Lord. And he reached out to us with the show pitch, and we almost never say yes to show pitches from outside people. And this is probably one of the first we've ever done, but I'm glad we did it.
Yeah. And he's such a gentle heart. Like, I appreciate that about him, and very clear in his explanations. And I'm telling you, that booklet is so helpful. So make sure you download it. Hey, I know that there isn't much structure to this part of the show, but I did want to hit on some of the things one thing at least that's been happening in the news this week. And it doesn't necessarily tie into mental health, but I do want to encourage people in not allowing something to drive us crazy. And that is the situation with former President Trump. And so former President Trump was found guilty on, I think it's 34 charges. And everything I have seen in the news, and I'm not speaking to whether it was fair, unfair, or anything like that. I do have my own personal feelings, emotions about it, and things like that. But one of the things that I've seen is people comparing Trump to Jesus and saying, just like Jesus was unfairly tried, Trump is being unfairly tried, and things like that. And just a lot of comparison to Jesus and Trump, and a lot of strong emotions going on. And I can get the strong emotions. I can get, being irritated and upset around something that is unjust, or, the shifting of a country into a way that we might not like, and things like that. But I wanted to just encourage people not to allow this to send us as believers to a place that is incorrect theologically. Trump and Jesus don't compare. Trump is a sinful man.
Well,
Jesus
and he
is a
was
perfect
doing
God.
a sinful thing.
He was doing, yes, but I mean, just regardless of
Jesus
that,
was totally innocent,
and all that has brought our country to this place, because I know some people are like, well, it was the Democrats and they're just trying to trump up charges and get him there, and regardless of what he did, because look at Clinton when he did, there's all kind of things. The bottom line is that Trump is a sinful man and Jesus is a perfect God. And so what we don't want to do is conflate the two, or make it seem like somehow what's happening to Trump is anywhere near what happened to Jesus. And so my call and my encouragement to you in this, as irritating and frustrating as this time is politically in our nation, and as confusing as it can be to try to explain to children, is to keep your eyes on the word of God and allow Jesus to be Jesus. Like, don't take Jesus and try to connect him with Trump in this situation. Remember, our foundation is Jesus. Remember, our foundation is scripture, and that's what we squarely stand on. Whether the ride in culture and in our political climate is good and smooth sailing, or whether our political and cultural climate is rough seas, we ride with Jesus, and we don't now conflate Trump and Jesus, or create heterodox or unorthodox ways of thinking around a situation that should never be. So that's just my encouragement tonight, because I've seen a lot going on these social media streets, and I've seen a lot of people hurting and complaining and very angry. And I'm not saying that those emotions aren't rightfully so. What I can say is that we must always trust Jesus and be united in the reality that Christ alone, it is Christ alone. And so we're not looking to any political man to save us, to save our nation, to X, Y, and Z. We look to Jesus first, and then we can align our biblical principles with those who might uphold those things. And so that is it.
Yeah.
Any thoughts, comments, questions?
No, that was well stated. I think the only thing I would say is, since we're on the topic of mental health tonight, like, be careful of how much emotional capital you spend on every crisis. Like, social media, Twitter is just designed, the algorithms are designed, it knows what you prefer, and it sends you information to get your emotions going. Resist the temptation to just always let your emotions be stirred up. That's not healthy. And if you find yourself in that place, it's okay to, it doesn't, our principles don't have to always, be about our emotions. We can still have principles, but just recognize that, this is what I believe, and that's okay. And, but we don't have to, if everything is about triggering us and we're allowing ourselves to be triggered all the time, that's not good for us. And we want to be sober minded about things. And so I don't know. I think that would just be the only thing I would add is just be careful how you're managing your emotions and how much emotional capital you're spending on being angry. So,
Yeah. And that doesn't mean that it's not angering or that people
no.
aren't, using our political systems and our government and country for ways that are ungodly.
Yeah.
That is 100% happening. That is 100% true.
Yeah.
And I would say that despite all of that, the person that we ride with is Jesus. I'm not riding with Trump. I'm not riding with Biden. I'm not riding with Kamala. I'm not riding with DeSantis. I ride with Jesus. And I see him as the standard. I see the scripture as the standard. And then those who may align, I can now say, okay, this aligns with it. It's kind of like what David talked about in regards to mental health and looking for a counselor. The scriptures are our standard. So I'm not going to allow my emotions to get all out of control regarding this situation with Trump. As much as it might be angering, I'm not denying the emotions that can rightfully come when something wrong or angering has occurred. What I am saying is that we don't now do unbiblical things or create extra biblical scenarios. Like what is happening with Trump is the same, just like what they did to Jesus. No, that's not true. And it's an unbiblical statement.
Yeah.
And so we have to be careful in what we do and how we think about things. We must think about things from a firm foundation of the scripture first.
Yeah.
And so, yes, Cassie on Facebook says, I'm going to get messages that Trump is a Christian. Send me your messages. I'll stand 10 toes down on what I said. Send them. That's okay. It'll be all right. Send them to info@centerforbiblicalunity.com. Go ahead. I am okay with the message or two because my plumb line is always going to be the scriptures. That doesn't mean that I don't have room for
It's the
error.
same as
I
it
won't
was
mess
4
up.
years ago. Our standard
it
has
is.
not changed. And
It is not.
we're going to get comments about like, that we're soft and, all of this, or that we don't see what's happening in the culture and we don't see the demonic schemes. Look, we see it all. We see it. We see what's happening. We have opinions. We have thoughts. We have things that we agree and we disagree with, even among ourselves. And that can all be a conversation. But no matter where you fall on those issues, it has to be Jesus first.
Yeah.
That has to be our foundation. That has to be our standard. And that is the foundation of our unity. And it's not a wimpy foundation. It's a robust foundation. We've talked on this show for years about the transformative nature of the gospel. We're not your girls to come to have a lackadaisical approach to cultural transformation. That's not us. That's not what we're putting out there. What we are saying, though, is that the ground of everything is Jesus, and it's the gospel, and that is the foundation of our unity, and it cannot be our politics. It can't be a personality.
Yeah. All right, girly. I think it's time for us to go because rumor has it we're going to go get ice cream. I'll meet you there.
Is that what we're doing? All right.
All right.
It's Saturday night. It's finally my Sabbath. I'm going to go rest.
All right.
All right.
You guys have a great weekend. Have a wonderful Sunday, and we will see you next week. Bye.
God bless.
There's nothing